One cold Thanksgiving evening in 2013, I was in my car on a dark, lonely road waiting for a car to go by so I could make a left turn into my subdivision to go home. All of a sudden, a man in a large coat and black hat jerked open my passenger side door with the intent of coming inside. God only knows what would have happened if my 130-pound St. Bernard Pyrenees mix had not been snoozing in the back seat. As soon as the man tried to get into the seat next to me, my faithful, ever-protective Macy lunged over the car seat in an attempt to attack him. He screamed and literally fell out of the car as he hadn't even had time to close the door. I saw the roads were clear, so I quickly stepped on the gas to escape. Macy was so agitated by all of this, she actually tore chunks out of the back door's paneling. She was out for blood. The police never located the intruder, but I had been saved by my dog. On another occasion years later, a man was trying to escape the police who were after him, and he ran into my home brandishing a gun. Macy was sleeping by my feet, and as he entered the back door, she flew up like a bat out of hell to go after him. I don't know whether the gun was loaded or not, or if he just didn't want to call attention to his location, but thank God he didn't shoot her. He turned and ran out of the same door he had just entered. He tried to climb over the privacy fence, but Macy grabbed his pant leg and held on. The culprit kicked her lower teeth with his other foot, but she still kept holding on. Just then, two police officers looked over the fence to see what all the commotion was about, and once they saw it was the person they were chasing, they climbed over and arrested the man. He had tried to rob someone at gunpoint at a traffic light just 2 blocks over. They were so impressed with my dog. After filling out a statement, all while the robber was yelling at me saying he was going to sue me, I took Macy to the vet to have some dental work done. Her sweet, crooked smile was always a reminder of how she possibly saved my life. I lost my beloved Macy to cancer in January of 2017. She was 13 years young. She was a great dog. I went surfing and I got picked up by a huge wave. I lost my board, and I guess the band wasn't securely put on my ankle, and it ripped my board off my leg. I tried to yell for help, but the currents were huge. I was probably 70 feet away from the coast. I yelled maybe 3 times in a 25-minute time span, and I was getting very tired. I kept trying to swim back, but the current kept pushing me further away, and I kept tumbling underwater and then back up. I ended up being so discombobulated I couldn't tell where shore was, and it took me about a good minute just to figure out where to swim towards. Out of nowhere, I hear my 2 dogs barking and swimming towards me. They swooped me up and swam me back against the current. I felt really lightheaded and weak after treading water and fighting currents for 25 minutes, so I have no idea how long it took my 2 dogs to swim me back, but they were carrying me as dead weight through enormous waves. Needless to say, my dogs saved my life. I will, without hesitation, kill someone for the life of my dogs. I owe them my life. A few years ago, I had been living in my house for a few months. I had a dog, who was a mix of a collie, retriever, and either greyhound or whippet, and 2 roommates, a married couple. One of them played a ton of World of Warcraft. He'd often go to bed just as I was getting up to get ready for work. One night around 4 a.m., my dog hops off the floor where he sleeps in my room and starts barking at my bedroom door. Thinking he was just barking at my roommate shuffling around downstairs, which was always the case before this night, I ordered him back to sleep and tried to get back to sleep myself. 30 minutes later, and he's sitting right by the bedroom door, just whining and crying like he has to go pee in the worst way. So I hop up, open my door to let him downstairs and outside, and he just bolts out in front of me. He goes down the stairs, into the living room, then right back to me, halfway down the stairs. All of a sudden, this stranger walks out of the living room. I was still groggy and not wearing my glasses, so I didn't quite understand what was going on. I asked, "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" He mumbled something that I couldn't understand. I asked again, "Who are you? What the fuck are you doing in my house?" He answered, clear enough that I could make out, "You don't remember me? I used to buy weed from you here." I had been in this house for a few months, never sold weed. Previous owners were in the house for 20 plus years. Pretty damn sure they didn't either. Then the fog of sleepiness lifts, and I realize this guy is a burglar. I point at the front door, and as tough as I could sound, wearing only boxers and clocking in at maybe $1.60 and 5'8", I say, "Get the fuck out of my house!" My dog has been baring his teeth and growling the whole time, sitting right beside me. The guy looks at me again, looks at the dog, and then does indeed get the fuck out, as fast as his legs could carry him. The one smart thing he did was slam the door shut before my dog could get through it, otherwise it would have been game over for him. I then proceed to curl up like a baby, run for my cell phone, and call 911 while shaking uncontrollably. TLDR, my dog made sure he could cash the checks that my mouth wrote when it came to home security. The dog in this story was, for the first 2 years of her life, the most unfriendly, shy dog in the world. She would never let us touch her, even though we raised her from a puppy, and the only reason she didn't run off was because we fed her. She was meant to be my dog, but I was very disappointed. One day, she was chasing geese on our neighbor's property, and he shot her in the head. She survived, but the vet had to take out one of her eyes and sew it up, and she spent 2 weeks recovering in my bedroom, and I took really good care of her. She was amazingly friendly to me after that. Now the heroic part. About 3 years later, I was walking home from a convenience store in a pretty rough neighborhood, and I noticed these 3 guys walking after me. I just sort of figured they happened to live in the same direction as myself, and I didn't think much of it. That was until I began intentionally taking nonsensical streets and paths to see if they were actually following me. It turns out that they were. I started walking faster toward my house, and they started calling after me and breaking into a run. As soon as I turned onto my street, Luna, who was my 140-pound Labrador and Great Pyrenees mixed breed, charges past me with her hackles up, huge teeth bared and looking altogether frightening with her one eye. The guys freak out and run in the other direction. Luna came back to me and escorted me home. It was a dark and stormy night. No, really, it was. My dog Jackson and I were spending the weekend with my then boyfriend, now husband, and his 2 labs, Gus and Boo, at his place in the foothills southwest of Denver. It was a Saturday night, and we were a bottle of wine into the evening and watching a movie. Suddenly, we heard this strange sound, like a woman screaming. My boyfriend's house was on 5 acres and backed up to the Pike National Forest, so we never heard people, and hearing this sound was really eerie. Derek, my boyfriend, jumped up to see if the security lights had been triggered by movement, but it was all dark. He theorized that it was the wind, which was howling around the house like something from a gothic novel. He suspected that it lifted the storm door too, which shrieked on its hinges. We just went back to the movie. Jackson jumped down from the couch and went downstairs and out the dog door into a fenced-in dog run. Jax was a little guy, just 18 pounds of Pomeranian and Papillon descent, an absolutely fluffy-butted nutjob. And with those giant ears, he was also a tremendous watchdog. No one sounded the alarm quite like him, and we routinely went into DEFCON 1 over deer in the gully, chipmunks on the deck, or a car approaching from half a mile away. He was mine and I was his, and he was clearly sworn to protect me fiercely. Almost immediately, we heard Jax just losing his mind down in the dog run. To be honest, I had learned to kind of ignore him over the years, after so many false alarms, that is, and the labs were similarly unimpressed. But Derek decided to go down anyway and see what had upset the little guy. The entrance to the dog run was through a sliding glass door, with a porch light on the right as soon as you stepped out, and the dog run extended about 40 feet to the left. Derek built it himself out of wood and chicken wire. As he stepped outside and his eyes adjusted to the brightness of the floodlight, Jax ran in front of him, still barking furiously, and then Derek saw something he couldn't immediately make sense of. Crouched about 15 feet away was a very large animal, which he first mistook for another dog, until he saw its tail whipping around excitedly. He realized it was a large mountain lion, probably 125 pounds, and it was crouching over a juvenile mule deer, whose throat it had just torn open. And there was little floofball Jax, who had courageously run in front of Derek to protect him, just barking his fool head off like both of their lives depended on it. And they probably did. Derek began to shout at the cougar and wave his arms, and then swiftly stepped forward and scooped up Jax. It's funny the things you think in an emergency. He later confessed he was thinking, "Oh my god, that cougar is gonna kill Jackson, and she's gonna break up with me." The cougar ran off, and Derek brought Jax upstairs, where Gus, Boo, and I were calmly sitting, blissfully unaware that an apex predator had been skulking about. Derek's face was white as a sheet, the first and only time I've ever seen anyone look like that, thankfully. We went back downstairs to investigate how all of this ended up in the dog run. We also had to get rid of the small deer carcass, as the cat would surely return for it. Derek was able to heave it over the 4-foot barrier and into the snow, and we could see where the cougar had apparently chased the poor thing straight into the fence, actually crashing through it. We don't know if the sound we heard, the one that sounded like a woman screaming, was the call of the cougar or the last sound the little deer made. What we do know is that Jax was willing to sacrifice his life to save Derek. The next morning, all that was left were a few bloody paw prints. Boo found the remains of the deer a few days later, buried under some tree branches and dried leaves. All that remained were the hooves and the skull. Jackson died from lymphoma last year. He slipped this mortal coil on June 15, 2017 at 9:30 a.m. He was only 11 years old, but was the silkiest-eared, bravest dog I've ever known, taken from us far too soon. The whereabouts of this cougar are still unknown, but I like to think that he still fears my mighty Jackson, all 18 pounds of him. I worked some pretty weird hours, and I got home from work late one day. Feeling guilty for my dog Axel to be cooped up all day, I decided to take him to the dog park. He was an 110-pound black German Shepherd. It was a little late after 11 p.m., but the gates to the park were never locked, although the park was not lit at night. Anyway, I take him to the park and we were the only ones there. We run around and play with the tennis ball for a while, when all of a sudden, he stops playing and stares hard into the dark parking lot, and his hackles go up. At first, I couldn't see anything, and then I see a large man walking towards the gate, but the guy didn't have a dog. He wasn't coming to the park for himself. Axel rushed the fence and threw himself at the gate, making the most mean, aggressive bark, growl, or snarl I'd ever heard. I had never seen him do anything like that before. This was a dog who barely even barked ever. After Axel rushed the gate, this guy backed off and walked the perimeter of the park towards another entrance. Axel strode the length of the fence, keeping pace with the guy, head down, ears up, and growling. The guy starts to come into another gate, and Axel rushes the gate again. This went on a few more times. Once the guy left my line of sight completely, Axel came back to my side and sat at my feet, but still stared off into the parking lot. I was honestly too scared to leave the quote safety of the enclosed area to get to my car, so I sat there with my dog and watched him. This guy must have hung out in the darkness for a while, because Axel wouldn't even play ball and wouldn't budge from my side. He just stared into the parking lot. Every now and then his eyes would track to a different area of the lot. He would just stare there and growl some more. Eventually, Axel got up, got the tennis ball, and brought it back wanting to play again, so I trusted that the man had left. I took that chance to run to my car and leave. This was incredibly scary, but I have no doubt that my dog saved me that night. My parents had a German Shepherd named Winston when I was very little. My grandparents lived in the mountains out in the country, and we were all visiting at the time. My dad, grandfather, uncle, and mentally challenged cousin went out into the woods to get some firewood, taking Winston with them. Fast forward to when they were chopping down a tree, and realized my cousin was nowhere in sight. The tree starts falling and Winston bolts, quicker than any animal should be able to run. As my dad is watching Winston, he catches sight of my cousin, right in the line of the falling tree. Winston manages to beat the tree to my cousin by fractions of a second, sending my cousin flying across the forest and out of harm's way. Unfortunately, Winston didn't manage to get out of the way in time, and the tree crushed him. My father was both proud and devastated. It took him 25 years before he got another dog. I have a very large Great Dane named Gus. He's older and somewhat lazy these days, but he's still almost right at 40 inches at the shoulder, and was at one point 215 pounds at his heaviest. At the time, we used him to flush cattle, deer, and other things out of the brush we couldn't get into when I was at home on the ranch. He was quite an adventurous and fun dog, Plus, he made a great security system in the apartment I lived at for college at the time, which was in a rather sketchy neighborhood. A couple of summers ago, I was working on some stuff for this old lady who lived next door. She had a backyard, and Gus really liked to run around and play in there while I fixed things for her. It had a small fence, but nothing too major. There were also some nasty neighbors who had a few really mean pit bulls that just roamed the neighborhood, causing all sorts of problems. I was sitting there working when I hear this growling behind me. These 3 pits have just jumped the fence and are approaching me, snarling and barking at me too. One of them starts to charge at me, when out of nowhere Gus flies in and lays waste to these 3 dogs. I always knew Gus was pretty powerful, but it really hit home when he grabbed a full-grown male pit bull by the back of his neck, shook him like a rag doll, and threw him a good 6 to 8 feet. He then proceeds to use his giant paws and just wrap the shit out of the other 2, rolling them and sending them running. In all honesty, he probably saved me from getting mauled, as I'm pretty sure I couldn't have fended off 3 dogs like that. He's also saved my butt a few other times too, but I think that was the best day he's ever had. We've had several break-ins the last few years. Once when I was asleep, 1 a.m., when Jack, my dog, literally jumped through the door towards the living room, just for me to find him guarding an intruder who was absolutely terrified. I had 3 mastiffs in the house at that time, so Jack had some serious backup too. I called my dogs back and the intruder ran away. I informed police, and the cops were disappointed I didn't keep him hostage until the police car arrived at the scene. There had been several assaults on homeowners during robberies in the neighborhood lately. That guy was probably one of the perpetrators. Not even 2 years later, we had just moved to another city, and a couple of guys broke into my home with knives while I was at work. Jack was injured, but they were probably even more injured, if for nothing else than for falling through a large window on their way out. If it wasn't for Jack, they could have been there when we arrived home. Those were just 2 instances when push came to shove. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure he spared me several surprises just by the fact that everyone knows that there's, quote, a huge big pit bull living in my house. By the way, he's not a pit bull at all. And yeah, he's big, but he's the most gentle soul ever with his family. My dog didn't save my life, but he saved my husband's dog's life. I had a Great Dane named Tonka, and my husband's dog was a pit bull named Diesel. Anyway, here's the story. We moved in together officially about 2 or 3 months ago. The dogs knew each other and were, quote, civil to each other in the past, but living together was a different story, and I was worried. They both adored me, and jealousy factors came into play a lot with growling and showing of teeth. There were never attacks or anything, just brotherly quarrels. One night, I'm at home by myself while my husband, boyfriend at the time, was at work. It was nice out, so I go outside in the backyard with the dogs, who were all too eager to play. They each pick up a stick and parade around, trying to get the other, if not me, to chase them. So, while they're prancing around and giving little playful growls at one another, the pit bull happened to break his stick and all he had left in his mouth was a twig. No matter, he disappeared around the side of the house where they do their business, and I thought nothing of it. I remained with Tonka and was enjoying him, quote, buck and prance around with his stick, when all of a sudden he freezes. He shoots his head up and looks over where Diesel disappeared to, and then dropped his stick and ran in the direction. I was oblivious. I thought maybe they had heard something on that side of the house and were going to investigate together. Suddenly, Tonka is rushing back at me, bouncing and looking extremely antsy. He's whine barking at me, like he does when he wants something, and switching directions from running to me to running to the side of the house. He's never done anything like that before, so I'm instantly alarmed, and I follow him to the side of the house where before I even round the corner, I hear choking. Diesel still had the twig in his mouth and was choking on it. One end was lodged in the back of his throat, and the other end was at the roof of his mouth. His gums were extremely bloody from his furious pawing at his mouth, and his hind legs were buckled on the ground out of exhaustion. I raced to him in horror and shoved my forearm in his mouth to hold it open without a second thought. The dislodging of the stick was pretty easy to do so once I got it from the back of his throat. All the while, Tonka watched on with perked ears and a serious face. He wasn't moving a muscle. When I calmed down and let them into the house, Diesel went in first. He then turned around and gave Tonka licks on his nose. Every night since then, There are always licks to his nose.